Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the IACA webinar on International Anti-Corruption in Procurement, Lessons from the Pandemic. We are happy to host you today online together with our esteemed speakers on this very important topic, who will discuss among other on the key anti-corruption strategies in procurement during the pandemic, patterns of corruption emerged during the pandemic and future strategies for addressing corruption in procurement. Before we start the panel discussion, allow me to take a moment and to introduce shortly the International Anti-Corruption Academy, who is organizing today's event. So the Academy is based in Luxembourg, Austria. It's both an international organization and an educational institution. It was established on 8th of March 2011, and to date, the Academy has a constituency of 79 parties, comprising of 75 UN member states and 4 international governmental organizations. As of August this year, the Academy will count 80 parties. IACA aims to deliver anti-corruption education and training for professionals and practitioners from all sectors, while forging partnerships to develop anti-corruption initiatives, provide technical assistance, and serve as a platform for exchange and dialogue. IACA is offering 2 master's degree programs in anti-corruption, compliance, and collective action. One is Master in Anti-Corruption Studies, or the MAX program, and the other International Master in Anti-Corruption Compliance and Collective Action program, IMAC. These programs are interdisciplinary courses and focus on both theory and practice in the fields of law, economics, political science, sociology, and behavioral science. Online, this year, IACA is offering fully online master degree programs. The MAX program will start mid of October, and the applications for the program are available on IACA webpage, the same as for the International Master in Anti-Corruption Compliance and Collective Action program. The MAX is focused on the public sector, while the IMAC is targeting business sector professionals and deals with business sector related issues. In addition, IACA is organizing also open or standardized trainings and tailor-made trainings. And this year, IACA is organizing its traditional 10th edition of the International Summer Academy training in an online format, and applications are available on IACA webpage, as well as more information about the activity, which will be implemented from 5th to 11th September. We are going now back to the panel discussion, and before I give floor to our speakers today, I would once again like to say thank you to all of them, especially big thanks to our moderator today, Professor Christopher Eukins. Chris, thank you very much once again for taking this responsibility, for supporting the Academy with this event, and also thank you to all contributions that we are going to hear today from all the speakers. Allow me first to introduce Professor Eukins. Professor Christopher Eukins serves as co-director of the Government Procurement Law Program at the George Washington University Law School, and has taught there on contract formations and performance issues in public procurement, bid protests and claims litigation, state and local procurement, anti-corruption issues, foreign contracting, procurement reform, and comparative and international law. He has testified on issues of procurement reform and trade before committees of the US Congress and the European Parliament. He is a visiting professor of the Université Paris-Nanterre, where he lectures annually, and has taught a week-long course on procurement issues and corruption at the International Anti-Corruption Academy in Austria. He has spoken as a guest lecturer at institutions around the world, and he was a contributing editor to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime Manual, guidebook on anti-corruption in public procurement. He is an active member of the Public Contract Law section of the American Bar Association, and is member of the Procurement Roundtable, an organization of senior members of the US procurement community. He is a faculty advisor to the Public Contract Law Journal, is a member of the editorial board of the European Procurement and Public-Private Partnership Law Review, and is on the advisory board of the Government Contractor. He has worked on a wide array of international projects on capacity building in procurement, and he was an advisor to the US delegation to the Working Group on Reform of the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, Model Procurement Law. Together with his colleagues, he runs a colloquium series on procurement reform at the George Washington University Law School. In private practice, Professor Jukins has been an associate partner and counsel at leading law firms and currently is counsel at the firm of Arnold and Porter. Well, welcome once again, Chris. And today with us, we have Mr. Majid Elbaya, who is a global lead procurement specialist working in the government's procurement global director's office, focusing on operation procurement and procurement monitoring and oversight, as well as leading procurement studies and research at the World Bank, Washington, USA. He obtained his PhD and master's degrees in civil engineering and from the University of Missouri, Columbia, and his Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from the Birzeit University, Palestine. Mr. Elbaya is involved in providing assistance to the Global Procurement Director in the review of complex and large value procurement, procurement monitoring and oversight, management, country procurement, assessment and reform, quality assurance and capacity building. He has worked extensively on country public procurement reviews and reforms and has delivered many capacity building workshops on the World Bank procurement procedures and contract management. He is part of the Procurement Task Force on COVID-19 emergency operations. He currently leads 2 teams for the preparation of a World Bank procurement report and World Bank flagship report on public procurement. He also worked as senior operations officer and lead senior procurement specialist in several countries in the Middle East and North Africa, Europe and Central Asia, South Asia and East Asia and Pacific. He was coordinator for 10 years for the PR IMO forum in Europe and Central Asia region. Welcome once again, Majid, and thank you once again for accepting an invitation today. Then we have Ms. Despina Pachnou, who joined the OECD in 2012. She's currently heading the work of the OECD Competition Division on competition in public procurement and enforcement against cartels. She led adoption of the OECD recommendation concerning effective action against hardcore cartels in 2019. She's currently developing an OECD recommendation on transparency and procedural fairness in competition law enforcement, and started the revision of the OECD recommendation on fighting bid rigging in the public procurement. Before joining the OECD, Despina worked as a lawyer in public procurement and project development in energy and infrastructure, and advised the Greek chapter of Transparency International on transparency and compliance in public contracts. Despina holds a PhD in public procurement law from the University of Nottingham and a master's degree in European Union law from the College of Europe in Bruges. Thank you very much, Despina. It's a pleasure to have you today. Next with us, we have Mr. Constantine Palicarsky. He is a crime prevention and criminal justice officer in the implementation support section of the Corruption and Economic Crime branch of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. A lawyer with more than 20 years of experience, Mr. Palicarsky is a part of a team based in both Vienna and in the field that is responsible for providing technical assistance to state parties to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption for the more effective implementation of the convention. Mr. Palicarsky has been implementing and leading anti-corruption technical assistance projects in Central and Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, the Pacific, Africa, Southeast, East and Central Asia, and the MENA region with focus on corruption prevention, support to anti-corruption agencies and effective UNCAC implementation. Thank you very much again, Costa. Welcome. Here with us today, we also have Gavin Hayman. He's the Executive Director of the Open Contracting Partnerships. Before joining the Open Contracting Partnership, Gavin was Director of Campaigns and then Executive Director of Global Witness. He oversaw the organization's groundbreaking and award-winning investigative campaigning and advocacy work, uncovering secret deals, corruption, and conflict around the world. He helped create the international Publish What You Pay campaign and helped negotiate the Intergovernmental Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative that brings together oil and mining companies, home and host governments, and civil society to improve disclosure and oversight of over $1 trillion of oil and mining money. He's an expert on illicit financial flows and helped lead global efforts to end the abuse of anonymous shell companies for money, laundering, and financial crime, including working with the British government's recent presidency of the G8 and the Open Government Partnerships. He has a doctorate from the University of Reading and has worked with Chatham House in London and the United National Environmental Programme in the past on analyzing and investigating global environmental crime. Gavin, thank you very much as well. Welcome. And in the end, I'm very honored to be here with you and to facilitate this online webinar. My name is Petra Sušac. I'm working at the International Anti-Corruption Academy as a head of general management. Here on the slide also you have my contact email address, and I would be happy to hear from you after the webinar if you will have any additional questions related to the topic that we will discuss today, or any other questions related to the activities or IACA. Please feel free to contact me anytime. I will be happy to answer all your inquiries. Now I will hand over the floor finally to the panelists, to today's speakers, and to Chris. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. As Petra mentioned, I've done a number of programs with IACA, including a multi-day program, a week-long program in person at IACA, and teaching on anti-corruption issues in procurement. Today, we're going to be talking about some of the key anti-corruption strategies that we saw emerge during the pandemic. It was very unique demands of the pandemic in responding to supply chain problems, to medical supply shortages. And as a result, the anti-corruption strategies that were used were unique, and we'll be talking about those today. What we saw were a different pattern of corruption emerging during the pandemic. New sorts of corruption that we really didn't expect. Things like in New York City, if you wanted to buy, there were literally millions of masks available, but they were hidden in warehouses around New York City. And so how to deal with the corrupt actors who were holding those masks back created real challenges for the procurement community. Some ways the procurement community succeeded, some in ways the procurement community failed. And what we'll be talking about today is some of the strategies that we've learned from the pandemic that can be used successfully in the future after the pandemic, and preparing for future emergencies as well. That's an important theme that we'll be hearing about again and again today is how can we set a template, how can we set a framework for dealing with future emergencies as well. Not just looking back at this pandemic, but how can we set a structure for future emergencies, but also make the procurement system healthier overall. Thank you very much again for joining us. And Petra, next slide, please. Michelle, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Well, thanks to IACA for inviting the World Bank to be part of this good webinar. And today I will share with you some of the experience that we have at the World Bank tackling the COVID-19 emergencies. As everyone knows that this is a supplier market, which is making a challenge to our buyers in the government, our borrowing countries, where they are willing to accept any terms, any conditions and contracts in order to secure the supplies, the medical supplies and equipment. And we, the bank, we have faced challenges during these emergencies, which is different than any other emergency we worked on. We have worked on different emergencies, whether it is natural, security, whatever you call it. But this kind of emergency under COVID-19, it is completely different. In a sense that we, the World Bank, as well as our client countries, we are at the same wavelength, i.e. both of us, we are not able to travel. We, the bank, we have forced to work from home since March until today, and the same as our client countries. And this is really created a big challenge. And in our portfolio, we have faced different challenges for different kind of scenarios, because we have contracts already ongoing, and this face challenges different than the procurement for regular projects like any road or a school you procure or plant, which is not a COVID-19 emergency contract. And then we had the challenges for the procurement of the medical supplies and equipment to address COVID-19 emergency needs. So in ongoing contracts, we face the challenge that some contractors, they were not able to get their staff back on site because of travel restrictions and the fear of spreading the virus. And this created some challenges to our client countries, because how you're going to deal with this situation where the contractor is not able to perform the work because of staff, or because the material to be shipped cannot be shipped because of the border closure of these countries. And the same with the procurement of conventional projects, which is not related to COVID-19, is basically some countries, because they closed their borders, they were not allowing original bids to be submitted. And this by itself is a challenge, because they were afraid of the spread of the virus, or the delivery system is broke. And then under the COVID-19, the procurement itself for the medical supplies and equipment, the issue is lack of supply, high demand on certain medical equipment and PPEs. And because of the high demand and the low supply, you have prices going up in the sky, and you have also the issue of imposing contractual terms on the buyers by the suppliers, which are normally not acceptable in normal situations. This issue has created some challenges when it comes to the quality of the products to be delivered, as well as some integrity issues and contractual terms, like the need for a 100% advance payment on a contract. With the supply shortages, we, the bank, looked at the issues and understood the market by doing a market research when it comes to the medical supplies and equipment. And we adapted to meet the requirement of the current emergencies by providing the flexibilities in procurement, where our regulations provide us with that ability to provide the flexibilities in critical emergencies. So the bank has moved quickly on this aspect by establishing quickly a procurement task force to tackle the issues needed and coming in a procurement. The bank has drafted quickly guidance notes to address procurement to our staff internally, to educate them on the flexibilities and how they can tackle issues related to procurement under the current situation. And we had lots of frequent meetings with the staff so that we listen to their questions, we answer them, management at high level, top level in procurement, the global director, the chief of procurement officer. So we have the policy management and we have the implementation management in these meetings to address questions to staff so that everything is clear. And we have provided the flexibility in project preparation and implementation. And just an example on a project implementation flexibility, We normally, under conventional, like normal time, a project to be prepared will take around maybe a year or less or more. But under emergency situation, we cannot afford that. We have projects prepared within a week or two. And when it comes to procurement, there are requirements to prepare, for example, what we call a project procurement strategy for development that the client need to prepare. We need to assess the risk of a procurement. And all of these things, we provided the flexibility that those could be prepared during the project implementation if they cannot be prepared quickly during the project preparation. And this is a great flexibility because you would like to move quickly within a week or two. We have provided also direct contracting flexibility. You could go as it is needed for any contract. The use of the UN organizations has been going in different countries. Different countries, they use it easily and negotiate a contract directly with them. And we have provided that all contracts under a project to be subject to post-review instead of a prior review. Normally, some contracts after a certain threshold, we would require the bank to prior review them before our borrower could proceed in the advertisement and the award of the contract. But under COVID-19 emergency, we allowed all contracts to be subject to post-review, where we can come after the fact and review the procurement and the contracts to ensure that it is aligned with the bank procedures. And we facilitated also the use of e-procurement, of country e-procurement system, and the use of submission of bids through email under certain scrutiny conditions. And finally, we have introduced for the first time in the bank what we call a bank facilitated procurement, where we, the bank, as part of the procurement task force, we facilitated negotiating contracts with reputable suppliers on medical equipment as well as medical supplies to be ready for governments who would like to benefit from these contracts on a direct contracting basis. And this is really proved to be challenging and at the same time rewarding to our client countries, because we were able to get in certain circumstances good prices because of the mass purchase, and also because of the reputation of the bank. Suppliers are willing to give good terms instead of dealing with countries and dictate their own terms. And as you know, under the current circumstances and emergencies, the prices are fluctuating on a daily basis and sometimes on hourly basis. I recall that an offer has been given to us and they said, either you take it within 4 hours or it's gone. And it was gone because the way we deal with the process between countries and so on, it's not something that we can do within a couple of hours. And with all of these flexibilities we have provided, we have to ensure that we have a good oversight and monitoring of these contracts. So some countries, they have requested the bank to assist them through providing hands-on enhanced implementation support, where the bank can really go the extra step by working with the government on like drafting the documents, helping them in drafting the contracts and so on. And the bank facilitated procurement could be seen as enhanced hands-on implementation support by adding a little bit more. And what we also did, is frequent reviews of contracts. And in some circumstances, and it happened, where we review the contract terms and we see that the terms are not really acceptable to the bank, even after the contract has been signed. And with the discussion with the suppliers, they were able to and willing to change the terms to be acceptable to our client countries as well as to the bank. In addition, we have requested our procurement staff all over the countries that to be really doing the post reviews as they go. They don't wait until the end of the year or so, but to go while the contracts are being finalized to review the contract terms or just after the contract is signed, so that we be proactive when it comes to issues related to contractual terms. Also, we ask our staff to stress on our client to provide the information on the contracts being procured and signed to be entered in our digital procurement portal. We call it a STEP, so that we can monitor the contracts being signed and being procured. In addition, we have frequently and on a continuous matter, we do a price comparison between bidders, between the market prices, and do benchmarking between suppliers' prices and UN prices, and making sure that the prices are reflecting the current market situation. The task force I mentioned established at very early time in the COVID-19 meets every day to discuss the issues related to procurement under the bank facilitated procurement and other aspects, and other meetings if needed will be during the week. And this shows how very closely we were monitoring the procurement under COVID-19 in order to be vigilant and making sure that we don't have issues. In contracts where goods need to be supplied to countries, we requested that there will be a pre-shipment by third party to ensure that the PPEs are really what intended to be procured, because the contractual terms, as I mentioned, are really more relaxed. Like normally we would have in a normal contract a 10-20% advance payment. Now we are agreeing in some cases for 40%, sometimes 50% advance payment, but we insist on having a bank guarantee against this advance payment to ensure that the money will not go without delivery of the supplies. And with the third-party insurance or inspection, we ensure the quality of the goods. And we still have our system going on when it comes to allegation of fraud and corruption. So all contracts signed need to have the clauses on a fraud and corruption, the standard clauses, which allow the bank to investigate and inspect files of the contractors and the subcontractors, and allow our integrity unit to inspect and audit these files. And this is very important, because once we have this and we see any fraud and corruption, we could take an action and apply our remedies, even if the contract is signed, delivered, and the money is paid. So our remedy is there, and we can declare misprocurement, we can cancel the fund, and we can call back this money even it is paid. So with all of these things, our oversight is really on a continuous basis. Our management is on the top of it, and I can tell you, in normal situation, you will not see my director himself doing crunching the numbers and so on, but you will see that he's doing this on a daily basis, going to management, going to staff, and asking them to check that and that, as well as the status of progressing of the contract to implementation. And also with the advices we provided to our staff, we told them and made it clear to them, be open, be flexible, ask the questions, raise whatever you would like to raise in order to make your life much easy and smooth when it comes to the procurement, the processes, and under the COVID-19, because it is really time sensitive. So with all of these things, we have been going and doing progress, different areas, under the bank facilitated procurement through the UN organization, as well as our conventional contracts are still going, and we review it. And actually our work increased when it comes to fiduciary in the bank. So you will see staff working from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock in the evening on a normal situation in order to help our clients to address the needs of COVID-19 emergency. I will stop here and I will be happy to answer any question related to this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Majed. So we've got a number of questions which we're going to have to hold till the end because we're running a little short on time. But just a quick question so that folks, Majed, can understand what you were, the framework in which you were working quite literally. Just a quick question, because a lot of the answers to the questions that we've been getting come in the World Bank's procurement framework that was operationalized in July 2016. Majed, this is the first real stress test for the procurement framework that was put in place in 2016. From inside the bank, did you have a sense that the procurement framework afforded you sufficient flexibility as you were addressing this crisis?
Yes, Chris, it is indeed the real situation. Based on the procurement framework we have all of these flexibility. We did not need to amend our procurement framework in order to address the emergencies. The guidance notes it is more of providing clarity and support to staff because of the high risk. When you tell our staff all direct contracting will be subject to post-review, this is a high risk things and the staff need to get the comfort, and that's basically the guidance notes provided. It's not something that we provided in you or we need to amend our procurement framework.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So Petra, I think we're ready to go on. Despina, the floor is yours.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Chris. Thanks, Petra. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. It's an honor to be on the panel. Thanks to the IACA and thanks to Chris for organizing the panel as well. So moving on from Majed, the OECD where I work does not buy. So you're not going to hear about procurements that we've run just because we're not buyers. I mean, we do buy laptops like the laptop I'm talking to you from, but not COVID related unless we're talking about the masks that were provided to staff that visits our offices. So while we don't actually buy, what we do is looking at what countries that buy do, and then we collect so-called good practices, and we issue recommendations to help buyers along. What we've done in my team, I work in the competition division of the OECD, and there we looked at the interface of procurement and competition during the COVID crisis, and in particular, we've looked at the risks and risk mitigation measures for emergency procurement. So, you know, it was very hard to avoid noticing, like everyone, that during the pandemic, health purchases, and Majed mentioned them, in protective wear, drugs, medical devices, in some cases in clinics, medical infrastructure, they went dramatically up. And most of these procurements due to lack of time and unforeseen circumstances, no one could have foreseen the extent of the crisis, were carried out through emergency procurement procedures, what is usually called a direct award to one supplier only. So what we did is we issued a policy note on this particular topic, as well as on other competition-related topics, including sudden price increases, that we put on our website. The link is on this slide, so you can go and look at the note. It's not very long, it's 4 pages, so it's quite easy to read. And there we discussed what might be the conditions of resorting to emergency procurement. Briefly, by way of background, non-competitive procurement across the OECD, across the 38 OECD members, is not the rule. The rule is competitive tendering. Direct awards generally in national law are strongly discouraged. It's not something that you're expected to do. You only forgo the competitive process when it's absolutely necessary, as was the case often during the pandemic. So we recommend to have a little checklist and check before you run an emergency procurement that you meet the following conditions, more or less. They are in more detail in the note. First of all, check that either there is only one available supplier, so only one person can give you what you want, or if there are more suppliers, be absolutely sure that you don't have the time to run a competitive process. Because otherwise, if there are more than one suppliers or you have a bit of time, you should probably be running an accelerated procurement process. You shouldn't be directly negotiating with one person only. If you do decide that you only have one supplier, then make sure that your need is current, is urgent, and happens now. This is because we've observed that some of the procurements that have taken place during the crisis were intended, due to the uncertainty, to cover potential future needs. And our recommendations, you won't see it like that in the note, is that, well, public buyers really have no justification for panic buying. This is maybe the case for consumers, but we expect public procurers to be savvy. In their procurements, they should cover the volumes and the items that they really need, and what they don't need, they should put it aside and try to plan it as part of a more normal competitive tender. Also, and this is a usual condition, if there is an emergency, then the emergency should not have been able to have been foreseen by the authority and should not have been contributed to by the authority. For example, if a procurement authority fails to plan when it had time to plan, then the grounds for resorting to emergency procurement are not there. We also recommend to check if there is no existing contractual arrangement that could serve the purpose. Let's say that you have a framework agreement that is already in place, and you can use it, meaning that your suppliers that have been preselected under the framework agreements have delivered capacity, which was not always the case, as we know, during the COVID crisis. The reason we recommend that is that these pre-existing agreements, we presume, have been tendered out in the past using the usual competitive tender. Therefore, the terms on which they were agreed were more competitive. So exhausting these existing possibilities is a first step. And finally, the recommendation, which it all makes sense, what we say, it's like the boiling down of good practice across countries, is that direct procurements should gradually be abandoned. So the pandemic had the first wave that nobody was expecting, and everyone was in a rush to procure things that they didn't have in sufficient volumes, like masks or oxygen devices. Should there be a second wave, in the medium term, we consider that purchasing needs are more easy to predict, and therefore competitive tenders should start being organized now. So that's for the conditions. Then we recommend some simple risk mitigation measures. One, I think, links very well to what Majid had just said. I mean, the recommendation is just document everything. Create a document trail which will serve ex post audits and will also serve in case you have a legal challenge by suppliers that were not, that did not participate in direct awards, who may claim that they had capacity. It's very important to keep written records of the need for a direct award and for all the reasons that led up to it. Also, transparency. Accelerated procurements or direct awards are done very fast, but after they're done, there is no reason not to publish the contract award decision. Likewise, if you extend the contract, if you modify the contract, you can publish that. So that's a clear-cut, relatively easy transparency requirement. Use some good commercial judgment. When you negotiate in a hurry this contract, it's, we've seen it, that the prices went up, and Chris mentioned it. The procurers usually have market intelligence. They know what's happening in the market absent the crisis. So they know that the price is inflated due to the low supply capacity. So it's important to include in the contract price renegotiation clauses so that you may be able to negotiate a price reduction after the peak of the crisis has gone. So it's important to use what you know about the market and adjust it a bit to the pandemic so that you're able to go back to the normal situation. And finally, a little bit on the role of law enforcement and ex post control. And from my side, you'll hear a bit about what competition authorities can do. So competition authorities are mandated to look at procurements and can punish suppliers that have fixed their prices, that have artificially raised their prices. An important thing, because it has been really widely discussed, during the crisis, many competition authorities, including the European Commission, have issued policy notes that explain how competitors in a market can cooperate, for example, to develop vaccines or to coordinate deliveries or enhance their supply capacity, which is normal to respond to the crisis. That's fine. That may be allowed. What is not allowed, since we're talking about procurement, is fixing prices. There is no exception related to COVID on that. Law enforcement is as usual. It's the same as before the crisis. And I'm only stressing this, and I'm saying this quite strongly, because there have been arguments raised already by private companies that say that they should be allowed to coordinate bids, basically fix their prices, so that they can avoid going bankrupt, basically, so that they're out of a very difficult financial situation and that fixing bids is one way out. I'm saying what the response of the OECD is, which is no, that's this conduct continues to be illegal. There is no justification for it, but I'm also echoing what countries across the world have said, where the competition authorities have issued press releases saying our law enforcement goes on uninterrupted. Obviously, given the, for ex post audit, given the type of the markets that were affected by COVID, our recommendation, but it's very obvious, is that in the future, competition authorities should focus their attention on health markets. So, because we think that when they look into these markets in the future, ex post, they will find price fixing conspiracies. So that's it for me. I have a lot more to say, but I think I don't want to waste any more time, and maybe we should leave some time for Q&A. I don't know, Chris.
Yeah. Absolutely, Despina. I just wanted to throw a couple of things in. So first of all, you raised an interesting point about collusion among the suppliers. And we have a lot of folks on the line today who work in procurement on a day-to-day basis. What was interesting during the emergency is to solve the collusion problem. Oftentimes, for example, in the United States, there was a mechanical problem, a practical problem of moving millions of masks from China to the United States. And the medical suppliers needed to collude in order to be able to get the materials to the United States quickly. They were very concerned about antitrust liability. What happened was that the emergency agency took over the contracting process. The emergency agency, in essence, wrote the contract itself really quickly so that the individual vendors wouldn't have to collude with each other. It was really an interesting solution to put the contracting function completely into the agencies, so there would be no collusion among the vendors. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about something you raised here, which was price collusion, and before, Masha was talking about fraud issues. Enforcement, my concern during the pandemic has always been that if enforcement authorities focus on price issues, scaring the suppliers will simply go to another country and sell their masks somewhere else. Whereas on the fraud side, and we got a lot of questions on this during the course of Majid's presentation, the anti-fraud, let's say poor performance, enforcement mechanisms aren't very strong in many countries. So there tends to be a reliance or a focus on price issues as opposed to poor performance issues. Is that kind of upside down? Because if you're an enforcement authority and say, I'm going to punish you for price gouging, then no one will sell to you. And that's really dangerous in a pandemic. Would it make sense to focus more on issues of poor performance? If you sell me a defective ventilator, you will go to prison. Does that make more sense?
If the question is to me, for us, it's not an either or, because one contract performance oversight, and we haven't, now we're starting a cycle of focusing on it in my team, is something that we take as a given. So contract monitoring, again, there is no reason, unless you activate some contract laws on force majeure for pre-existing contract, there is no reason that you should excuse a faulty performance. What you're looking, when you are looking at price fixing, is that there has been any illegal conspiracy that is not justified, and this type of price fixing is never justified. However, what you can do, and I think you mentioned at the beginning, is maybe, and there have been press releases and communications from competition authorities allowing this, to collaborate for the distribution. To have one distribution line, for example, into the US, so that you can allow the supply to reach the hospitals, basically. So there are exceptions for essential deliveries, but there are no exceptions in the case of procurement, emergency procurement, and fixing prices or volumes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Petra, do you want to take us on?
Here it is. Constantine, yes.
Thank you, Petra. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank IACA and the organizers, all colleagues, panelists in today's webinar, for inviting us to join you in this most interesting event. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has a long history in cooperating with IACA. We are very happy that we can be a part of this event today. A couple of words on why UNODC is involved in this work. What is our place among all the stakeholders, all the players on the ground? The UN Convention Against Corruption is our framework. We are the Secretariat and the guardian to the UN Convention Against Corruption, and the UN Convention Against Corruption as a global anti-corruption framework already has 187 states parties. Article 9 of the convention focuses on the issues of public procurement, integrity in procurement, and on the issues of public financial management. And both these issues are of extreme importance in times of crisis. Article 9 of the convention suggests to the states parties to introduce public procurement systems based on the principles of objective criteria in decision-making, competition, and transparency. And the importance of these principles in emergency situations is even greater. We all heard how, because of the need to react quickly, governments are actually taking swift measures, are resorting to direct procurement, while this normally should be the exception, are using procedures where the competition is not the main feature, and it's important in this particular situation to emphasize how we manage the risks that emerge out of this situation. UNODC has developed an interesting methodology that we always recommend to our interlocutors in the states parties, to the anti-corruption agencies with which we work, to the procurement agencies, to the procuring entities at times. We believe that probably the best approach in this situation is to put in place a very agile system of identifying the corruption risks throughout all elements of the procurement cycle: pre-tender, tender, and contract management and administration. A system that is based on identifying, detecting the specific fraud and corruption schemes that have been taking place in the past, and assuming that if they took place in the past, it's quite likely that they could also take place in the present or in the future. And then looking at the actual documents, looking at the actual experiences the organizations were facing in terms of fraud and corruption, to try and develop mitigation measures that are very specific, that are addressing the fraud schemes, corruption schemes, and scenarios in a most practical manner, in order to stop them from happening. In one country, we got as specific as going into the documents in order to identify links between people in the procuring entity, in the contracting authority, and the companies that were bidding for contracts. And then based on these links, to actually suggest measures on how to ensure that nobody from the contracting authority is helping the potential bidders. The clear communication and reporting channels are something that we found to be extremely important. And people often refer to this as protection of whistleblowers, but it's not only about protection. It's also about making it possible that people who have knowledge that something wrong is happening actually can report their knowledge to the organizations that have as their main duty the enforcement of the rules. It is also very important from our experience to ensure that there is a good connection between the anti-corruption authorities on one hand and the supreme audit institutions on the other. You would not be surprised, I suppose, if I say that at times, and actually as a rule, these organizations are working more or less in isolation from each other. This was recognized as an issue during the last conference of the states parties we had in December last year, literally before the emergency broke out, where a resolution was adopted that is calling precisely for this, to make sure that the anti-corruption bodies and the supreme audit institutions are able to exchange information, to coordinate their efforts, and to take meaningful measures to learn from each other to address the risks of corruption in the public sector. It is interesting to see how the different countries are working to address the risks of fraud and corruption in procurement, but also I would go one step further and say in the whole issue of COVID-19 emergency packages that are being designed and implemented in, I could say, most of the countries in the world in a moment. And we have examples of bad practices, which include all those issues that were already mentioned: inflated prices, situations where certain contracts are initiated only for the purpose of actually generating illicit profit. But also we have interesting examples of good practices, and I will use some of the time allocated for me to share with you some of these good practices. For example, in terms of using existing tools and frameworks to address the risks of corruption. One interesting emerging practice is that all contracts and all grants that were issued using the emergency procedures developed or put in place during the pandemic become automatically subject of auditing and publication of the audit findings in one country. That also includes information on the beneficial owners of the companies that have benefited. It also includes, sometimes in another country, requirement for the executive to submit weekly reports to the legislature concerning all actions that have been taken while exercising the extraordinary powers that sometimes were given to the executive. I already mentioned the reporting channels. In one country, the anti-corruption authority is processing whistleblowing reports that are related to violations in the implementation of COVID-19 legislation with priority. And they have already received more than 50,000 complaints, and have analyzed more than 50,000 complaints that are related to violations of the implementation of the COVID-19 legislation. In terms of public procurement, an interesting practice that we have identified is the pre-registering of suppliers, sort of a vetting that takes place in advance to quickly check on suppliers and then ensure that the procurement process goes without concern about price rigging or using or that falsified products could be delivered under the contract. Again, the issue of beneficial ownership transparency. This is an issue of great interest for countries, and in one country, all information concerning the crisis-related public procurement is made publicly available, including the information on the beneficial owners of companies. Countries are extensively using internet portals to ensure transparency of the public procurement, and that also includes public procurement in the times of the COVID-19 emergency. Open data and open contracting are also very interesting and very important measures that are being used, transparency of open data, and also emphasizing open contracting. While the COVID-19 related procurement may be excluded from the typical procedures, it is very important that transparency is ensured to make sure that one day, if there were irregularities and malpractices, those would be investigated, and we would be able to eventually ensure that there is effective system of accountability put in place. I would like to draw your attention to some documents that we have developed. The links on the slide would take you to the Article 9 guide that Chris already mentioned. He also participated in the development of the guide. It's a document that basically summarizes a lot of our knowledge on how to address corruption and fraud in procurement. We have since then worked since 2014, 2014, when it was published, gained a lot of new information on the typical corruption schemes and scenarios that are taking place in procurement. We are in this relation also preparing in a moment fraud and corruption risk management guide that emphasizes fraud in procurement. This should be out really soon, we hope. With this, I would like to end my part of the presentation, and I will hope that there are questions that I could answer at a later stage. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Constantine. We're going to flip over to Gavin now, and we're shooting for a soft end at about the half-hour mark, but Petra's told me that it is a soft end. So, Gavin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I'll try to go fast so we get to lots of questions. The Open Contracting Partnership, just to give you a quick bit of background, we're a silo-busting collaboration across government, business and civil society, really trying to open up and transform public contracting. We're working on both an open government and user-centered design approach towards changing procurement systems that actually work for real human beings, and also opening up the data and information from those systems and making it freely reusable and accessible to drive great analysis and scrutiny. So we're working across the entire chain of public contracting in about 25 different countries, including 6 members of the G20. So quite a kind of broad global portfolio. Next slide, please, Petra. Thank you. One of the key things we offer and support is an open contracting data standard. It's not like a pass or fail standard, but a schema to unlock and share information around public procurement to make it useful and really to drive better data analysis of what is going on. Really to take public procurement from being a paper-based, like document-based approach towards being data-driven, so it can really help users. And the Open Contracting Data Standard is a free schema. We, as I said, publishing in about 25 different countries. We support governments to unlock and share their own information. We're not doing it for them. It's not an EGP system. It's simply a way of expressing and sharing information openly coming out of it. Next slide, please. And very important for us also to measure the impact of our interventions and really try and sort of learn and share what works as a kind of global community. So next slide, please. I'm going to track over to talk about the public procurement and corruption in the time of coronavirus. Now, it's worth saying public procurement is government's #1 corruption risk anyway, even before the crisis hit, right? There's the statistics from the Anti-Bribery Convention show that about 57% of bribes are paid for public contracts. So it's already a risk. Then you have the sudden incredible surge in demand, driven by the kind of coronavirus for particular materials. What's also really important to think about is also the fact that we've had an unprecedented supply shock that's happened to the world as well. So at the very time of demand surging, you know, like for critical kind of materials, for protective equipment, you've had the main workshop of the world shutting down. And that twin shock is really interesting and has led to some very particular effects in terms of the pandemic, because it's not only just about a desperate scramble for supply, but also a real with whom are you dealing? Knowing your customers has become incredibly important, because we've seen just this huge change in different companies offering different materials. We published a jokey idiot's guide to looting public procurement that lists a lot of ways that you could do that. So this goes way beyond bribery to how we stack tender specifications to favor particular crony contractors, or alternatively, you can bid and win completely fairly and then corruptly double the price of the contract and give kickbacks off the back of that. So there's many different points in the chain of public procurement that are extremely vulnerable, and all the more so when you have this twin shock that's going on. Next slide, please, Petra. So, can you go back one? So just sort of quick shout out, if you want to read particular hair-raising case studies, if you go to the Organised Crime Corruption Reporting Projects, the OCCRP, have done a brilliant series on crime, corruption and coronavirus, really looking at particular methodologies and people involved. Could you move the slide on? Thank you. Yeah, so they've looked at just all sorts of different cases. One example, just to give you an idea, a known associate of organised crime in Romania. Can you go back one slide? A guy known as Manu the Bomber, been involved in supplying counterfeit masks, you know. So again, that issue of with whom are you dealing? You know, if Manu is covering your procurement needs, you're probably in trouble. In this case, OCCRP are accusing him of providing counterfeit masks with questionable certificates and everything else. That gives you some idea of the challenges that people are facing. And let's face it, we are seeing a Hunger Games out there, we have been, where you've not only had like central government buying, you've had individual hospitals, states, regions and cities all competing. And it's been really kind of unedifying, striking. Loads of examples from around the world. OCCRP looks at that in Eastern Europe, but we've seen it directly with our own work in Latin America. Some of our partners directly working on open contract in Ecuador have been able to identify and investigate frauds. Next slide, please. And it's also worth saying that there's a huge amount that can go wrong even without crime and corruption. So mistakes have been made left, right and centre. The UK has had loads of problems connecting buyers and suppliers. Something like 25% of the government suppliers of PPE equipment are completely new and haven't had contracts with the government for the first time, based on the UK's published data. That gives you some idea of the challenges. So next slide, please. So my recommendations are first of all about setting clear policies in place to oversee public procurement. Now, quite often that will be emergency procedures, but if I can say one thing to you take home today, the number one thing is you can buy fast and you can buy openly. The two aren't exclusionary, and in fact, they're highly complementary. The countries that we're working in that have been publishing good data have been able to still publish good data and have found it's helped them adapt to what's going on in COVID-19. It's really important you put key safeguards in those emergency procurement procedures for rapid disclosure of information, and also requiring a written justification of why an emergency procedure was used. And also, very appropriately, price gouging other provisions. And Chris has been sharing examples from the US in the chat if people have been following that. So those are all really clear things to do. An example would be Ukraine. Now, Ukraine has a great, very open public procurement system based around the Open Contracting Data Standard. Their simplified emergency procedure for COVID-19 materials requires publication in 24 hours, right? Compare that to the UK, where it's about 20 plus days, which is just far too late to connect buyers and suppliers in a really useful way. Next slide, please. One thing the UK has got right, though, is requiring a clear, documented set of tests to be met as to why you are using an emergency procedure. I won't go into the detail there, but there's quite clever how they've asked a series of different questions that you have to justify. You know, an unforeseen needs that wasn't due to you being late, but due to something genuinely unforeseen. Something that's unforeseen now may not be unforeseeable in the future. We all know we have to buy more PPE for our hospitals, so we can't keep using emergency procedures. So just an example there of how the UK has tried to do that. Next slide, please. My second point of advice, coordination, right? It's really important to centralize and coordinate procurement. Doesn't mean that one department tries to buy it for everybody else, but how you actually set frameworks in place. So in Colombia, for example, they set a single COVID-19 emergency framework, got all the buyers and suppliers onto that, and they published all the information around that. It's taking place in real time. They're sometimes doing direct contracting off that, but they have a single kind of emergency frameworks in place that's helping kind of the coordination and also just the people trying to actually meet each other in a suddenly kind of changed marketplace and everything else. You can, of course, aggregate demands, and within that, you can put clear oversight mechanisms in place. A nice example we were talking about in the chat was Chile, which has to deal with earthquakes. It's actually anticipated that demand in advance and said, can you pre-register and share the information who can provide 80,000 sleeping bags in 1 week to, for this situation? And that's something I think government's going to have to get a lot smarter at. We've had several months to plan for the crisis. It's amazing how slow government responses have been as an observation. Next slide, please. Disclosure and data. So absolutely no excuse for losing information during the crisis. And indeed, if you are publishing high quality open data like some governments have been, it's been incredibly helpful to actually address this. There's no reason a government cannot tag all its contracts related to COVID-19 emergency process as COVID-19, collect and publish that data. I would really encourage the World Bank to be doing that very proactively. If I can abuse my role as a panelist on the webinar to one of my fellow panelists, that would be really helpful. The UN should be doing that as well, right? We should all be doing it, we're all in this together. It really helps buyers and suppliers. You can also disclose technical comments from suppliers and all the awards for emergency framework. Next slide, please. We have published a guide to help governments and civil society and others do this. We know of about 10 governments around the world that are directly publishing open data on their COVID-19 procurements, and that's helping all the monitoring I'm just about to talk about next. Go on. Next slide, please. Great example, this is from Lithuania, which is currently working on implementing open track data standard, but a very clear COVID-19 dashboard with all the main buyers and suppliers registered there, who's buying what. Why aren't we seeing this from every government in the world, right? How can people really do their jobs in the dark if they haven't got this kind of information? This is the future, folks. So next slide, please. Another example, this is from Chile, which has great open data from its public procurement system, widely regarded as one of the earliest EGPs, but they've been continuing upgrading it since then, where you're just seeing they are matching effectively buyers and suppliers and looking at the flows and the different links between different people. This is really interesting because it's a civil society monitoring project off the government's own procurement data. Just a very smart kind of intervention there. Chile's had some medicine procurement scandals in the recent past. It's learned from that to actually publish really good real-time information at the moment. Next slide, please, Petra. So I said how important it was, and Constantine was saying about the beneficial ownership. Absolutely. As we said, if a quarter of your suppliers you knew, it's great you're going to try to them, but they can't let you down. People will die if they don't get their masks in time and everything else, right? So what we've seen, some great innovation off their information, particularly for COVID-19 procurements. And those do link through to things like on the beneficial owners. You can also look at suppliers and buyers and look for patterns between the two in government interactions. Next slide, please, Petra. Here's an example. So to give you some examples, risk analytics, in this case, in Ukraine, that's just going through and looking at links between buyers and suppliers. And that's dealing with conflicts of interest where buyers might be buying from people they have links to directly. Some of them are very simple, like spreadsheet-based approaches. Some are more advanced analytics. The second one at the bottom is looking at abnormally high volumes of transactions by particular buyers and matching patterns there. So they're beginning to use open data as the feedstock for better AI-driven kind of analysis of what is going on in machine learning. Next slide, please. And then civil society monitoring. So an incredibly powerful tool in these scenarios. We've seen some great examples of civil society driven monitoring. So we're working with Open Society Foundation and Transparency International's Global Health Programme to directly power up civic scrutiny at this time of need. And we've seen, for example, civil society working with the government of Moldova to take the information from their EGP system and to catch and report all the COVID contracts and begin to do some analysis around this. There's also a great example from Ukraine that publishes open contracting data where there's embedded civic monitoring all public contracts, and they've been able to create particular tools monitoring prices in real time of vital PPE. Next slide, please, Petra. So here's just an example of that, looking at medical grants. They can look at masks as well, quality, who's paying for what. There's some certain spikes there. Those would be the things that you'd want your auditors and the other people who are then going to kind of follow the money, as it were, to begin to investigate and see what's going on there. Is that gouging? Is it a supply shock? Is it something else? So lots of things you can do. I just want to say, kind of, hopefully I'm sharing some of the approaches that people have been taken that are already working for them now. There's no reason these can't be scaled up as we move from response to recovery. And we always say, open contracting partnership, the future is open.
So thank you. So Gavin, I actually had a question about this chart because I looked at it before. This really highlights the issue we've been talking about. This chart shows a 300% increase in the median price of masks at a certain crisis point. So contrast this with, as an anti-corruption device, South Africa set up a process early on where the framework agreements that were in place before the pandemic would set ceiling prices during the pandemic. So essentially, South Africa constrained the ability of its public and procuring entities, some procuring entities, to purchase above those ceiling prices. But here you see an explosion in prices. Wouldn't that be mortally dangerous, Gavin, to set a limit, either a soft limit by saying we're going to prosecute you for price gouging, or a hard limit on prices? Wouldn't that be mortally dangerous during a disaster?
That's a great question. So if you can, as I said, goes back to point 2 around coordination and planning in advance, and a big fan of, yes, getting those frameworks in place to anticipate future emergencies like Chile's done. Completely agree with you. This is interesting because this is civil society monitoring the prices paid by different government departments. The government is not capping prices. What I wanted to show was this is the beginnings of people starting to ask questions, and hold on, there's a lot more being paid for. Let's explore why that is. Is it a demand, challenge, or is it something else? Is it someone deliberately agreeing artificially inflating prices? If you looked at those, if it's particular municipality and they're paying a lot more, is that bad buying, or is that something else that needs to be investigated? The classic example everyone knows in Ukraine is the $100 mops from the oncology clinic, right? Where effectively, it is just a mop and a bucket, but they're paying $100 for it. So I'm not trying to say it's one thing or the other. I believe nowadays we can begin to start analyzing what people are paying, and better information in real time is informing those choices. I think that's what's important here.
I think you highlighted something else really important as an anti-corruption effort. It's the politics of information, Gavin. If I talk to American government officials and I say, you really should make your data, including data, for example, regarding contractor qualification, you should make it available to people in Romania. The government officials, U.S. government officials in public forums will say, why should I care? They're not Americans. They're not taxpayers in my country. Why should I care about making it public? What you've highlighted, which is really interesting, is the role of civil society. Civil society in any given country has the political leverage to force that transparency because they are taxpayers, they are citizens in that country. Civil society opens the door, and once that information is on the internet, then it's usable by other countries as they respond to the same pandemic, the same disaster.
Absolutely.
Okay. So Petra, we are close to the end of our time. I just have I have a couple questions that I want to ask the panelists, and we also had questions. Did you want to elevate anybody, Petra? Do you have any questions that you want to, folks that you want to bring forward into the panel? And in the meantime, I'm going to ask just a couple questions. This is for, the first one's for Majed. This is important because one of the things that we saw during the pandemic, and this isn't really corruption, this is a separate issue, but very severe import and export constraints being put into place by countries around the world, including my country, including the United States. And it's politically very divisive here about whether or not there should be constraints on things that are vitally necessary for humanitarian purposes. So Majid, could you talk a little bit, was the World Bank able to use the United Nations distribution network in order to bypass import and export controls that would otherwise constrain the redistribution of critical supplies?
Thank you, Chris. Yes, actually, as part of the bank facilitated procurement for the supply of PPEs, one of the challenge is because the supplier, most of the suppliers are coming from China, and because of the high demand, the suppliers over there, they are not willing to ship outside China. They will sell you inside the China in the airport, and you deal with it. And another risk was some suppliers, they were raising issues of confiscating of PPEs en route to final destination if they stop in certain countries. Because, you know, it's a vital issue that you need this on time. And some of these shipments, they were stolen en route. So want to take this. So what we did is we explored different avenues to get the goods supplied to the country. So we had the agreement with WFP where we could use them to deliver the goods from China to countries. And also we had negotiated or considered the DHL to deliver the goods as shipment, as well as has the option of the supplier himself could supply on a CIP terms. So all possibilities were considered just to make it happen. And in addition, we also had cases where countries themselves, they were willing to send their own planes to get the goods from China. So all possibilities were on the table and were considered. Yes.
Thanks very much. I have a question. We have a question from Professor Lambsdorff as well.
Professor Lambsdorff?
Yes, thanks for including me in the panel here. It's been a fascinating debate, and I must confess I have lots of questions. But first one sort of refers to what Constantine has been working on, and was Maja is certainly also responsible for. And I wonder whether Article 9 of the UNCAC is currently a good guidance for us during this pandemic, because what we observe is Article 9 of the UNCAC has such a clear focus on objective criteria which should be predetermined and which should allow a verification afterwards. And we're currently in a situation where there is simply no time to set up adequate tender procedures to find out what objective criteria might be. So aren't we currently experiencing sort of the limits of Article 9 UNCAC, and are we currently about to explore novel types of procedures in the awarding of contracts that sort of are better capable of dealing with procurement?
So if I could throw in a first response to that, and I welcome further responses from the other panelists. So the article that you're referring to, Professor, is Article 9 of the UN Convention Against Corruption. And from a procurement standpoint, Article 9 really reflects 1990s science in procurement. The science has evolved a lot since then, and Article 9 is one of the problems with UNCAC is that the convention itself is frozen. And so while, for example, as you're referring to, it calls for objective definition of what's to be bought, oftentimes it's exactly what you don't have anymore. Oftentimes with multilateral competitive negotiations, you have a very subjective, I want to buy a good transportation system. system, and you let the market develop what the solution is. So UNCAC is out of time. It is out of date. But, and this is an important thing to stress, because many of our audience members are working in international organizations, working in countries where systems are developing very rapidly. While UNCAC, the convention itself is too static, there should be a mechanism for updating the convention, and there isn't a ready one at this point. The review process, the peer review process under the UN Office of Drugs and Crimes, the UNODC, facilitates a peer review process where two countries will review one country's performance under UNCAC, and they'll do that on an ongoing basis. Those peer reviews are fascinating, and what they do, Professor, as a practical matter is, as the peer review progresses, the reformers in any given country, they don't look at what the language is of the UNCAC. They don't look at Article 9 or other articles in the Convention Against Corruption. They look at international best practices, and the reformers then will use the review process to try to prompt reform against international best practices, using the international reviewers as outside critics that'll help prod the government towards what the international best practice is. So while the convention itself, the text itself, is too stuck in time in the 1990s, the review process is brilliant and helps reinvigorate these anti-corruption systems in the countries that rely on them so heavily.
Maybe I could add a word. Obviously, I would not go as far as saying that the convention is obsolete. Definitely not. And when we speak about objective criteria in decision making in Article 9, that essentially means that the buyers should know in advance and should make in advance clear to everyone what actually they want to buy and how they will decide whether a certain bid is better than another one, whether a certain bidder offers a better service or a better product than another one. And I may agree definitely that in certain situations there is a bit of a lack of clarity. We want the best transportation system. It could be a case, but most of the cases, most of the situations, what we really want to buy is not the best transportation system. It's just, a car or a tram or a locomotive. And then we really need to clarify what actually we want to buy, what sort of a car we want to buy. And indeed, in some situations, some countries, some procuring entities may have gone beyond that. But our experience is that even these basic standards of knowing in advance, clearly defining in advance in a transparent manner the criteria for participation and selection of candidates, this is not there. And we would really suggest, before moving to something beyond these basic criteria, to have these basic criteria implemented. And then maybe in the future, we may get to a point when we need to think about something else. There certainly will be such a point in the future, no doubt. But you see, without really covering the basics, how can we advance further? That could be difficult, if possible at all. Yes, and of course, the UNCAC implementation review is a fascinating source of exchange of best practices for countries, and they indeed are able, in the course of this process, to learn on how other countries are implementing the requirements of the convention, or are going beyond these requirements. Indeed, this is true, and I would like to inform all the participants in our webinar, all the colleagues who are now listening to us, that UNODC on its website provides access to all executive summaries of the countries under review, and also to most of the reports. Not all of them are public, but most of them are. And in case if they're interested how exactly certain countries are dealing with the challenges in implementation of Article 9 of the Convention, it's all there. So check it out. Thank you.
Thanks, Costa. Thanks very much. So we have time for one more question from Malika. She's joined us from the participants.
Yes.
And then we'll have closing comments from Thomas. Malika, go ahead.
Thank you, everybody. It's a very interesting session, and for the non-expert, it's an excellent refresher course. So big thanks. I work in the humanitarian environment, and as you know, most of people who have been deployed are those on the field, and they may not be procurement experts. So my question is a very pragmatic question. Where can we find fraud checklists that we can share with non-specialists who are deployed on the field, those who are on the first line of defense, meaning who have been maybe educated a little bit on the big rules and the key rules and the golden rules in terms of procurement, but on the top of it, a very simple fraud checklist. Does it exist? Where can we find that? Any suggestion is welcome. Thank you.
Majid, I think that you're probably the best position to answer that.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. We have in the bank our integrity unit. I have seen circulating a brochure, maybe a flyer of a couple of pages where they have red flag checklist in procurement. And I think that could be useful. I will dig it and maybe send it to Petra so that maybe she can share it with other participants. Also, I would like on the first point, Chris, if you allow me, if I understood the question right, we, the bank, we have the option of using output performance contracts. So basically, you look for the output, you don't look for the input, and the payment will be based on meeting the output performance terms. But you still have the criteria and the qualification requirement of the suppliers. You need to meet certain requirement and experience, and so on. And on the post-review, this is basically a general practice the bank has. It's not specific to COVID-19, but for contracts where we do not the prior review, they are all subject to post-review, which means that I can, as a bank staff, go and review the contract from the procurement process to the final delivery, and then make sure that the contract has been procured based on the contractual terms and has been used for the intended purposes. And if we see that there are non-compliance, then the bank will apply its remedies. And this is really very important because one of the questions raised whether during the COVID-19 emergency, the World Bank has looked at the concession of their department system. And what I could say on this is from day one, it was clear there is no compromise when it comes to the bank for zero tolerance of fraud and corruption in bank finance operation. And from day one, we said no way that we will allow any bidder, any contractor, suppliers who is on our debarment list or temporarily suspended list to benefit from a contract. That is clear, and there was no change on this aspects. And finally, we have conducted the survey. Actually, it is in the finalization where we went to all countries globally to ask them how they responded to COVID-19 emergencies and many other questions to find correlation and to find some interesting lessons to learn from. And one interesting aspect we found is that those countries who were in Ebola emergencies they were quicker to respond to COVID-19 when it comes to the legislative framework. And this is actually a good lesson for us to learn from COVID-19 to address critical emergencies in public procurement, because some countries, believe it or not, they were not able to move quickly because their legislative system is rigid and could not allow for the kind of a procurement they had faced under COVID-19, where prices are changing on hourly basis, and you need to go for higher value with direct contracting. And the last point that would come very important from what we have seen is the e-procurement system. Those countries who have e-procurement system already established and running, they were quicker to respond to COVID-19 challenges than those countries who do not have e-procurement system. So a focus in the future is also on e-procurement system. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's an excellent response. Gavin, did you have a quick follow-up on that, and then we'll close out?
Sure, yeah. So we shared with you our kind of Idiot's Guide to Looting Public Procurement, which actually gives you a series of red flags as to how people have cheated and what the methodologies are. And then we've also got more detailed reports that look at the red flags and how you look at those from actual scraping procurement data. I'm very happy to share that with anyone if they want to contact me. I'll put my address in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Gavin. So Thomas, did you have some closing comments?
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm not taking off where IT forced me out before, and I'm also not concluding here. I leave that to you. Just a few remarks. First, thank you very much to participants who have shed light on the enormous challenges we face limiting and fighting corruption in times of crisis. Of course, we're still too deep in the pandemic to take the necessary distance to assess the situation with the necessary objectivity. Another observation, in spite of the many activities in this field, there's still a lot of interest. Obviously, we don't have all the answers yet. Judging from the list of participants in this webinar, which is extremely interesting, there is a lot of interest still. And finally, Chris, I liked your reference to the civil society and transparency. I think accountability is one of the big issues, and here civil society has to come in to hold those who take the decisions accountable, that they abide by the laws they have themselves installed. Thank you very much for your participation. I hand over to you for your concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to close all the participants, thanking all the participants for their questions, which were very, very helpful. And the panelists did a wonderful job too. Thank you for your patience throughout. And finally, a special thanks to Petra, who is consistently sending out emails after midnight, every night, getting this together. We were very, very, very grateful for what she did. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you, and thank you to all the participants. We are looking forward to the next webinar. I would just like to announce it on 22nd of July. It will be on corruption and fisheries. So please stay tuned, follow our webpage and social media. We will announce it very soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
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 Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good day.
Bye.